My name is Max Page. I'm the president of the Mass Teachers Association. It's so good to have members and others joining us on this latest of our MTA forums. This is something we began last year where we bring important figures to talk about key issues in public education. Last spring, we had Heather McGee, who has written The Sum of Us. Congressman Jamal Bowman joined a panel to talk about the negative impacts, the destructive impacts really of high stakes testing and that regime. And here tonight we have Allison Butler and Nolan Higdon talking about making sense of surveillance technologies in education. And this is really obviously a key topic. I was thinking as this was approaching, there's that image of, well, a teacher goes into a classroom, closes the door, and they are there for they practice their craft alone, unhindered. But in fact, they're watched all the way in the classroom. The students and the technologies are watching them, influencing them, and it's a whole new world. And I'm really glad that Allison Butler and Nolan Higdon are here to talk about kind of some of the dangers we face, and also some of the solutions we may have as educators and as unionists. So let me now just really turn it to them. I said I would not do long introductions. We'll actually post in there. There you can see it. Inez just posted some information about these two outstanding scholars and activists, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So I really turn it over to both of you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Max. So we're going to share our screen, turn it over to a PowerPoint, but just a couple of quick things that we want to make sure. We recognize how it's so fabulous that everybody could be here via this technology, which of course, by the way, is a surveillance technology. So we also recognize the irony of that. But we would like to make this as interactive as possible. We won't be able to see your faces once, or at least I won't once I put the PowerPoint up, but please feel free to interrupt us at any time with either questions in the chat, or if you could raise your digital hand, because that'll kind of bring you to the forefront so that we can see what's going on. But with that, I'm going to share my screen and get us started on our let's get going here. So here's what we're talking about today: wrestling with privacy, making sense of surveillance technologies in education. I am coming to you from UMass Amherst, a proud MTA member, and Nolan is joining us from California, a proud member of his California State Union. So we're all very much on similar teams here. What we want to cover today: we're going to talk to you about these many things, and in true honesty fashion, we're probably going to be really depressing for about 85% of this, and then we're going to try and pick up the mood a little bit. So we're going to talk about what surveillance technologies are and where they can be found, the legality and culture of surveillance technologies, opportunities and threats of surveillance technologies in the classroom. Then we're going to brighten the mood a little bit and provide you with some practical support, some conversations, questions, lessons, and suggestions, and then really what do you need, and what can we do to support you. So to just start really briefly and kind of open up this idea of what are surveillance technologies, we've got sort of two intersecting things going on here. They are digital technologies that track and monitor use, and digital technologies that track and monitor behavior. And so we can find them in a variety of places. They are, and we'll go through some of these details in just a moment, but it's really anything from our personal devices to our personal web searches, but then also for those of us who are in classrooms using learning management systems, or using software programs that are built into our computers, or whatever technology we're using, or certainly the hardware that we're using. If we are working with students where we are given quote unquote free technologies to our classrooms, free or low cost. Data are built from this tracking, and it serves a host of functions. In some ways, and we'll absolutely address this, it makes our lives somewhat convenient, right? If we're sending a text message, it can predict our next word. If we're working in word processing, It can predict our next word. On many of our email programs, this is a lot of this stuff is the under the umbrella of generative AI, that it can finish our sentences for us. Maybe in the land of a little bit more scary is that it can determine our purchasing desires. It assesses our behaviors. It gives us information or takes information from us about our various locations. For the purposes of our work, and the purposes of what we want to share with you tonight, we're really focused on the surveillance technologies that are appearing in our classrooms and in our larger institutions of education. But we're also more than happy to talk about any of those other things, in part because none of them, and this we'll get into in a little bit, none of them are separate from each other. They're kind of all combined in a big way. So even if we think like, oh, I'm just doing this on my phone, on my personal time, maybe not so much, depending on what it's linked to, right? So I said we were gonna make you really sad at the very beginning. So couple of examples that we'd like to share with you. And we come at this, we've got some information about this a bit later on, ways in which we can push back. And both Nolan and I work within critical media literacy. So we also think about how, as just good old fashioned people, we have been presented with surveillance technologies in pop culture. So we've got a list of them here for you. And then we've got the references at the end. If anybody has ever read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it's a giant AI machine that figures out, sorry, spoiler alert, the meaning of life, which is 42, right? The meaning of life is 42, and this is what AI figured out. And then lo and behold, the planet Earth was destroyed to make way for a highway that was going to connect commerce. Real Genius from 1985. I'm going to see if I can show you this clip in a moment without it being too awkward with the screen sharing. We see a classroom overtaken by tape recorders. Parks and Rec, this is another clip that I'll show. A town is offered free Wi-Fi. But at what cost? Superstore, a new corporate owner provides fun technology, but what it does is it monitors the user's whereabouts. If anybody has made it through The Deluge, the nearly 900-page dystopian novel released in January 2023, one small through line of it is an eco-terrorist group that actually repurposes junk mail to avoid the surveillance that would then potentially monitor their activities. The most recent season and the last episode of The Morning Show, which is a show about talk shows, morning news shows, morning talk shows. One character realizes that her business partner and romantic relationship is surveilling her phone. And then another clip that we'll show, and this might be really important for many of the K-12 teachers here, is the way new technology is given to an under-resourced school. Nolan, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about where these surveillance technologies can be found.
Sure. Thank you, Allison. And yeah, thank you everyone for being here in this opportunity. This is going to be fun. Yeah, and so as Allison was describing, there's this new approach to surveillance, or this new fixation on data collection that largely society in general has accepted, but we're focusing mostly on the education spaces. And some of the concerns and perspectives on it have been covered in popular culture, as Allison was describing. But just to kind of set some of the groundwork from where we want to go from here, what are we talking about when we talk about this surveillance equipment? We're not just talking about the classroom hardware and software, but also the hardware and software that's in the school. Now, I think it's worth saying that all of us know this who are educators, that there's always been some mechanism of surveillance within the education process, whether it be teachers monitoring students and administrators monitoring teachers and some governing board monitoring administrators, et cetera. There's been some level of surveillance, but really what's different here is it's a few things. One is the extent of surveillance. This was pointed out in the introduction. We generally think of the classroom as kind of a secure, separate space where teachers and students can kind of experiment and make mistakes on their own. But increasingly, with the inclusion of these digital technologies in general, but a lot of this corporate software in particular, we see more and more data collection, tracking of students at the expense of privacy, and this is happening in schools as well. And the Some of the classroom hardware, just to give you guys some examples, are like Chromebooks, tablets, laptops. These are, corporate content, that's corporate tools that are brought into the classroom that surveil students' work. Now, there's a argument, obviously, by many in education, parents, thought leaders, and others who say that this technology is necessary for a 21st century education, and we're not necessarily here to dispute that point. But we do question in our research kind of the motives behind it. Is Apple really altruistic when they're giving these Chromebooks for free to a school, or do they realize by giving them quote unquote for free, that'll be the Chromebook that students use, and that's a way to get access to students' data? We've worked on other projects together, Allison and myself, and one of them, we looked at the long history of corporations trying to get into the classroom. Even though America is generally pretty supportive of the market and consumerism and capitalism, there's generally been a sense that schools are not a place where that marketization should be going on, that we shouldn't be advertising to students or purchasing things. There's always kind of been this belief in separating the two. And what we're making the case here within the digital era is that separation is almost non-existent at this point. So when we think about education, we need to see how much these ed tech tools are intertwined into the learning process. And so again, it's not just the hardware, but also the software, like learning management systems. Like I know Canvas has basically cornered the market. It's like a Blackboard or Desire to Learn or Moodle. Some of you might remember WebCT. I don't think that one's around anymore. But these learning management systems, in a lot of cases, because they've signed a contract with the school, it's the only learning management system that the educator is legally allowed to use on the campus. And if the teacher requires it, students are thus expected to use it as well. So it becomes intertwined in that sense. Outside of the classroom, we looked at some of the hardware. Some of these smart devices could be like smart televisions, for example, that are broadcasting what's going on campus or advertising things. Those can be always collecting data. Cameras, of course, collecting data that predates these digital era cameras. And then institutions also use various software and programs. Usually institutions mandate that you use school-approved email servers, which gives the school access to those communications. There's tracking systems like we use. I'm not sure how many of you use this in Massachusetts. We use Starfish out here a lot in California, where you plug in data about particular students and analyze that data to draw conclusions about the effectiveness of teaching, the effectiveness of support on campus, student success, et cetera. So both in terms of the classroom and the school, there's a lot of this surveillance going on. Before I jump to the next slide, I do want to also say that if you take a school device like a Chromebook home with you, that surveillance comes home with you as well, as we'll talk about. Some of these programs that schools use, or some of the software schools use on these devices actually track students while they're outside of school as well. So it becomes much more than just during school hours as well.
Nolan, can I tell a quick story? So part of our research also involves interviews with key stakeholders, privacy experts, K-12 teachers, higher education instructors, academic advising specialists, etc. And a couple of the teachers that we spoke with who teach in New York City, their students are all provided with their own individual Chromebooks, and they can take those home. And the teachers in these two schools in particular, are required to use Go Guardian, which is a program where the teachers can see their student screens. So you can have a classroom of however many students. The teacher has one computer screen like on their own desk, and they can see the students working on whatever it is. Oftentimes it is understood as a tool that can help. It's sold, if you will, as a tool that's going to help teachers work with students because they can have on camera or on screen access to the students' work. But it is also a way for teachers to monitor what students are doing. So saying like, hey, you actually need to close that browser, like you're not on task. Many of the teachers that we spoke with believed that they were the only ones monitoring the students. So I noticed there was a question in the chat about the sort of difference between surveillance and oversight, right? So something like Go Guardian is presented as oversight for teachers, but what's happening is that the company that runs Go Guardian is monitoring and gathering data on all of those students. And then if that's the student sort of take home device, anytime they use that device at home, they are still being monitored, and they could still be monitored both by their teachers as well as by the company. And we had one teacher say that she would notice that when students were like at home on, say, maybe they had stayed home sick, she could watch them watching whatever it was they were watching YouTube videos. And she thought that that was problematic, but she thought it was problematic by her, like her oversight, versus the idea that that is exactly how the program was built so that Go Guardian can monitor these young people at all times. It is often presented to a classroom teacher or to a school administrator as a tool of convenience, as a tool of safety. But what we would argue, what we do argue, is that it's actually capturing the very rich data of minors who might otherwise be legally protected from having their data being captured. But because it is a school tool, it is legally now captured. We also spoke with an early childhood educator. She works with like 2 and 3 year olds, and she is supposed to be using a program called Class Dojo that she is to enter in her children's behavior every day. And she had said in our interview that she categorically refused to do that. One, because she recognized it as a surveillance technology, capturing the data of 2 year olds, but two, toddler behavior is like notoriously erratic. What does like sending a report of behavior every day, what message is that actually sending? So I hope that addresses, and obviously we'd be happy to talk about it more, but that might be this question of surveillance versus oversight, and then how these tools are presented to our classrooms as here's something for you to use in this space, but it's actually something that is capturing everything at any time. And it's certainly with the idea of school issued devices, it absolutely brings up questions of class-based concerns, because if students have multiple devices and they might be able to separate some of them, but if this is a student's only access to the internet or only access to any kind of digital programming or word processing, we can certainly see a class divide, and a way in which the data of under-resourced schools and under-resourced families are just captured that much more thoroughly.
Thank you. You want to turn to the next slide? I'll just briefly answer 2 of the questions in the chat. They're sort of the same. One's about Go Guardian, one's about Bloxy.
Okay.
Do they work? Do they work at home? Yeah, they both can. Go Guardian does. Bloxy, I think you have the option to monitor it in certain situations, but I know for remote learning, Bloxy can be used as well. So I think that may be determinative of the school, but it does work outside of the school, at least in some cases.
And to get back to it being like the really scary part of our presentation, if a student or instructor or anybody takes a school issued device like a Chromebook or a laptop, and maybe they choose to plug their phone into it to charge it, or they've got something on their phone that they're, really planning on using for school that they're downloading to the computer, that enables the surveilling device to then have access to all of their personal data via their phone.
So something else we want to talk about here, thinking about the current environment of surveillance. One, we already mentioned, Allison mentioned at the beginning, but under this guise of convenience and improving learning, a lot of these digital technologies are added to the learning process, generally unquestionably. And there's not a lot of options for students and parents to opt out. Some of the popular software we've already talked about, but some others you guys might know, like Turnitin or Bark, are some other examples that we haven't covered yet. And then I think this kind of goes without saying, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A portion, or if necessary, or anytime we want. But there's huge amounts of profits for this data. So that's why we're skeptical of the kind of altruistic language by these companies about giving away this content, or promising not to share data and or sell data and things like that. There's a lot of profit to be made here, and in a U.S. context, many of you will be familiar with FERPA. Obviously, that it's part of the student rights revolution, and students are protected from having information given out about them in their involvement in a school. But there were some changes to FERPA in 2012 that are pretty critical. And the changes stem from the fact that a lot of institutions were using digital technologies, and there was an argument that by using those technologies, they were out of compliance with FERPA because they're giving private information about students away to these third-party companies. And so they changed FERPA law to recategorize these ed tech companies into what are known as educational partners. And so now they are covered under FERPA. They have access to this student data, so these tools can be used on campus. And depending on the contract they have with the school, sometimes they can't maybe sell data, but that doesn't necessarily prevent them from sharing data or sharing an analysis of that data. And it's hard to really put into words how lucrative this data collection is for these companies. It's almost unfair to call like Meta a social media company or Google a search engine. They're really advertising companies who collect data and sell it. And so the classroom, as I mentioned, is kind of one of those last spaces where these companies can get a lot of lucrative data.
So on this slide, we've got some names of stuff that might feel familiar to folks that maybe you are using or you're supposed to be using and you're rejecting. And I grabbed some of the questions from the chat about whether or not it's safer to toggle between profiles. No, I mean, maybe a little bit, but no, because once it's into, not to sound too much like Zoolander, but I do love a pop culture metaphor. It's in the computer, right? The data is already there. So even toggling between can still have access to data. And I'll give kind of an old-fashioned example of the sort of evidence for that. An old-fashioned just because it's gotten more sophisticated, like about a decade ago, a little bit less than a decade ago, anybody with a Google, like a Gmail email, or maybe your institution goes on a Google platform, it was pretty common knowledge that Google, quote unquote, read all of your emails, right? Uh, and what also happened is that the door is open. So if you emailed somebody, or if somebody emailed you from a non-Gmail account, that opened the door to Google, and they were able to then capture all of that person's data. So the digital lines between profiles, or say private browsers, or if you're emailing or in some way, shape, or form communicating with somebody who might be using a different device or a different software, it opens all the doors. I did also notice there was a question about the COPA. And no, I mean, the problem with the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which is law, is that it's really quite spineless. Some of it's almost laughably so. For part of what's in COPA is that for children under the age of 18 who want to do something that needs, like, say, like a credit card, or that needs some sort of permission, parents or guardians can fax a letter of permission. Um, not quite sure who's faxing much anymore. They can call a 1-800 number to verify their permission with something along the lines of a person on the other end trained to understand like age differences in voices. Also, not entirely clear how that works. Um, or there is also the presumption that children under a certain age do not have access to credit cards. So we can already see how many gaps there are within what is labeled as the children's online privacy protection. In fact, I mean it's a digital world. It's really hard to draw like hard and fast lines. But basically the idea is that there's really no way yet, or that has been approved yet to protect that level, other than saying no, because that's the thing with so many of these technologies, from our own personal social media use to what we might be using in our jobs, is you have very little to no room for nuance, right? Any one of us that have ever signed up for anything at all online, if we didn't read the privacy policy or we just checked off the terms of service, we've often given away our own rights that we might not necessarily realize that we've given away. A really great way to freak out college students is to find out how many of them are on Snapchat. Many hands will go up, and then tell them that the privacy policy in Snapchat says that Snapchat now owns their face. And that, that makes them all really nervous for a minute. So we have no gray area. We have no way of saying I agree to some of this, but not all of it. So we have to agree to it in whole cloth, which tends to therefore limit our own autonomy and our own ability to protect our information.
Yeah, and to add on to that, and I think a lot of you are getting at this in the chat, so we should make this connection too. Where COPA and FERPA meet, the idea behind COPA was basically that they want to empower parents to make decisions for their youth online, 13 and younger. But what's happened in schools now is schools sign contracts with these ed tech companies, and the assumption is that if you enroll your child in the school, you have agreed to the school rules. And so if the school has mandated the utilization of these, you've given up your COPA rights over that by enrolling the student in the school. That's the way it's been interpreted thus far. And I think this connects to Michael's question. Michael asked about districts requiring privacy agreements. There's a lot of great work that districts can do to protect the privacy from a lot of these companies. But unfortunately, what we've seen is a lot of people who are negotiating the contracts don't have a lot of knowledge of what these companies are doing or intending to do. And so it's difficult to be proactive. And that's one of the things we really advocate for in the book.
Do you want me to go? So this is basically one of the things that we think of in the current surveillance environment is what happens is beyond the technology, right? Neither of us are technological utopians by any stretch of the imagination, but we also work really hard to not be technologically dystopic. We want to try and think of the much bigger context, right? So some of our concerns with surveillance technologies is that it fosters a relationship grounded in mistrust. It builds young people's digital footprint without their express consent. It further stigmatizes struggling and at-risk youth, schools, and communities, all at profit for a corporation. So to go through those a little bit, for any one of us that have ever used Turnitin, right? If we teach in larger classes, or we have students submitting papers and we've been told that Turnitin is a good device for recognizing plagiarism. That is not untrue, right? It is absolutely going to recognize words that are similar to another program. But one other way of thinking about Turnitin, or a couple other ways of thinking about Turnitin beyond that, is that we kind of start off by telling our students that we expect them to plagiarize, right? That we expect them to be academically dishonest, that we expect them to lie. And I mean, students are going to plagiarize. They're going to lie. That is true because they are human beings. But when we start off the relationship that way, we start off a relationship grounded in mistrust. A side thing with Turnitin is it's used in a couple of different ways, right? Yes, it absolutely will detect plagiarism. And certainly that is understandable for any one of us who teach really large classes that, it takes out some of that labor and some of that concern so that we can think about the content of the papers. But behind the scenes, Turnitin absolutely is training generative AI, right? So it is feeding into all of our other concerns about ChatGPT or the other generative AI programs. It is also owned by Advanced Publications, which is one of the largest publishing conglomerates, and a lot of the student paper word choices are used as sold to like advertising and marketing as to kind of like what's being talked about, what's happening in schools these days, what are the word choices that are using, so that it can then get sold back to us in advertisements of what we might want to purchase. To Nolan's point about how if a school signs up for a technology, and that is where the permission lies. We are building minors' digital footprints without their express consent, right? And at least for the folks that we talked to for our project, some of the teachers and some of the guidance counselors that we spoke with would say that they're okay. Young people are okay building their own digital footprint with the stuff that they do, particularly on social media, because it is within their control. It is what they see as a mutually beneficial relationship. They see that they're getting something for it. But when they hear about either just their parents monitoring them or some of these larger technologies monitoring them, they don't see that as a mutually beneficial relationship. So it's a relationship of distrust. As we talked about a little bit before, these surveillance technologies further stigmatize struggling and at-risk youth because these might be the only devices that young people have, which means all of their information is being analyzed to some extent by this corporation. The technologies and the tools feel both ubiquitous and impenetrable. We might feel that we have no agency. Again, we're going to get to that a little bit later. And the surveillance technologies, as Nolan mentioned, like we have been surveilling students since there have been classrooms, right? And corporations have been working to get into classrooms since there have been classrooms. What has happened sort of somewhat stealth is the idea of these surveillance technologies becoming the umbrella under which everything seems to be happening these days. And again, in large part because of their convenience, they are presented to us as like this is sort of a good thing. But as we're trying to show by kind of deconstructing it, we can see that there are maybe some problems with it. I'm going to hop forward to the next slide, talk about legality. And Nolan, if you can take on this, I'll start looking through the chat.
Okay, yeah. Just as a shout out, Donna was in there mentioning about GM trying to get in the classroom, and Allison and I covered that. So we're semi-familiar with that story. Glad to hear, Donna, sounds like you're in the front lines of that. Much appreciated. Yeah, essentially one of the things we cover in the research that I think isn't too shocking, but privacy has been a concern for humans for centuries, and we talk about the philosophical need and legality of privacy throughout that time period. But we do find ourselves in an interesting space. One of the things when we present these projects, we'll get to this in a second, but when we present on this project, we often get the so what question. The so what? People are reading my emails, big deal, I've got nothing to hide. People want to look at my social media, whatever, they can bore themselves to death, et cetera, et cetera. And we think that is an important question. That's not something we dismiss or laugh away. We think we have to make the case for why privacy is important. And so that's one of the things we do in the text, and we're going to do in this presentation as well. But at least anecdotally in our experience, so I'll speak for myself, I think Allison would agree, but at least anecdotally in my experience, there seems to be not a firm acceptance of privacy being important as maybe I would have assumed there would have been. And so one of the things we're trying to do in this text is make the case for why privacy is important. Now we've talked about it's not like people are willfully giving up their privacy. In a lot of cases, it happens slowly. It's this soft surveillance where we have to use turn on our phone to use a QR code, or maybe we can only chat with someone through Facebook Messenger. Maybe we have to order on a menu. We have to pull out our phone to look at the menu. These are ways of giving up data, location data, surveillance data, behavioral data, attitudinal data. All those things that become normal, or communicating through social media becomes normal. And we kind of argue in the text, this primes you for larger surveillance questions, which not on the next slide, but the one after that, because we covered that, where you have things like COVID-19 and mass surveillance through tools as a result of education going remote. It's almost treated as normal, or kind of the way things were going. And so what I mean by that is, we had some like browser extensions that students were mandated to use, and the browser extension supposedly could use your camera and other devices to look through the room to see if you were cheating. So just this very idea that level of surveillance, digital surveillance, was part of the educational process had been primed for quite some time in the making. And as a result of that, it's almost become unquestionable conventional wisdom, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, where schools just assume that the only way to capture and understand students is through massive data collection. We don't really try a lot of alternatives at this point, especially in our discourse. Now, it's without a doubt, we're both educators, and we'll make the case about how overworked, exhausted, and buried in bureaucracy so many educators are. And as a result, technology sometimes can be a lifeline for a lot of educators in this context as well. And that also, further contributes to the problem. But we're not here to judge anyone for using these tools. We're educators ourselves, use these tools. We're on a Zoom presentation right now using these tools. So this is not about judgment, but merely kind of laying out the framework for what surveillance looks like currently. And then, Allison, did you want to stop there and answer questions, or you want to jump into the threats?
Well, we've still got one quick other thing to think about, and we've sort of danced around this a little bit. We've talked about it, and I've seen some comments in the chat about it, of FERPA. And so we know that, so this is just something to think about. This is one place where I think that PowerPoint's little icons can actually be really helpful. We have this notion of FERPA as protecting, right? And I work at a university. I am formerly the director of advising in my department, and I always had FERPA sort of at my back if I had parents that phoned, because the students that I work with are all over the age of 18. So I cannot disclose via FERPA any of their private information. So we do have this support from something like FERPA, that student data are protected from outside individuals or organizations. But thank you, PowerPoint, for all your little arrows. What we also have to think about is that many of these for-profit corporations file as quote unquote educational partners, which means they have access to protected data. So we'll often talk about or hear about companies, and maybe they'll tell us to this, right? Like, we never sell your data, right? And something that Nolan and I want to like really bring home is, we would actually maybe say, don't even worry about them selling your data. It's the fact that they might share your data, right? These corporations, as they file as quote unquote educational partners, that means they can gain access to protected data. But then what they also do is they kind of join together. So they become this sort of conglomerate of different corporations that have a stake in each other's operations, which means they do not need to sell your data, because they can share it with each other. And therefore, they're telling you a truth when they say we will never sell your data, but they're already kind of going to be digitally passing it around. So again, with this idea of context is, yes, we have stuff legally that is out there to protect us. And I did notice and made some notes of some of the things that y'all are talking about in the chat about privacy alliances. This is
Allison,
fabulous. Yeah.
Right before you get into that privacy alliance, can I jump in and just add one thing? Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. But I think it's important here. Canvas itself is not a company. Canvas is a learning management system that's owned by Instructor, and Instructor itself is owned by a private equity firm. And the reason why I'm telling you this, we could do this with many companies. I'm just choosing Canvas off the top of my head here. A lot of private equity firms, which again, private equity firms on the surface have nothing to do with education. They get into buying these companies that own these platforms because they not only want the education data, but they also can then collect data on individual outside of the education process and put it together in their analysis of that individual or that organization. So they may like there's some apps out there like Baby Connect is one we talk about where parents use to monitor their child. Well, if the company that owns that platform also owns, the Canvas that students are using all the way until they graduate college, and they also own the platform that monitors people searching for jobs, like a LinkedIn or something, or outside of college, you really have a ton of data on one individual for their entire life at that point. So these companies are not just finding like one single data point with one single management system. These are huge conglomerates collecting data from multiple points on individuals, and that's why it ends up being so lucrative. The reason why I'm bringing this up now is I saw in the chat some of the individual questions, and we're going to try and answer some of them. But some of them are difficult to answer because it depends on which company is accessing the data and whether or not they're sharing it with each other. I would err on the side they're probably sharing it, but that's a complication in answering the question. Is we don't know who's sharing data with who all the time.
The safe assumption is that it's probably, yes, they are sharing your data. So there was a question in the chat about if they were taking staff data. Yes. I think, I'll give another example and then we'll move on. So this is something that's at my institution. Maybe some of you have this at your institutions as well. It's a program called Glean. And I think this is the sort of dual-sided, the kind of double-edged sword of some of this. So Glean is a program, it's a British corporation that owns Glean. And it is a recording software. So it is sold to universities or other institutions as a note-taking device, right? So it will record lectures and provide students with the transcript of the lecture. And then it can also turn all of that into note cards and flashcards and study devices and so on and so forth, right? Any one of us that have ever worked with students who have had documented disabilities and have access to a note taker, Glean can come in as a real savior because it's instantaneous, right? I know at my institution, up until a few years ago, we would have to ask for a note taker in class who very well might have been taking notes by hand and then would have to scan in those notes. So they'd have to get themselves to a scanner, scan in those notes. It would somehow get sent to the student who needed them. Who knows if this would happen in time for the exam? Then we get something like Glean, which records the lectures and provides, and the students are provided with the software to put onto their computers for quote unquote free, right? Okay, so this is all incredible in the sense that now students have access to their notes instantly, right? They're ready basically as soon as the lecture is done. But there's also a downside to this because students are now recording their instructor's lessons, maybe without their instructor's proactive consent, absolutely without their classmates' proactive consent. According to Glean, implied consent is acceptable. So as the instructor, we're to say there is a student here who needs to record this lecture. Implied consent. The students who might not want to be recorded as part of that, assuming there's like a discussion part of the class, they either have the option to never participate in class or drop the class. So now we start to see some of the downsides to this, right? Depending on which state we're in, I know the majority of us now are here in Massachusetts. We're a two-party state, which means both parties being recorded or all parties being recorded need to be able to give proactive consent. we can't actually ask that of our students because then we'd potentially have to give away the privacy of the person who needs it. Sometimes it can just be really obvious. And at the end of the day, everything that Glean is gathering is training AI. So we are now having faculty who are kind of giving away their own intellectual property. A really dark way of thinking about it too is that if anybody gets upset with how the class was managed, all of those notes can absolutely be plucked out of context and presented in a way. So I would give myself as an example. I teach a class this semester. It's called Media and Education. And we talk about different educational theories and how they are represented in the media, how the stories are told in the media. So we do talk about racism, right? And there are things that we address that, if taken out of context, could be understood as absolutely 100% racist. The larger context is showing them how, showing these narratives how they've moved through time, and how we understood them in the stories that were being told in 1954 versus the stories that are being told in 2023. So we lose control of our intellectual property while simultaneously training AI. And so, and all of this, again, the language of Glean is implied consent. So that's part of the, the all of this sort of behind the scenes is the stuff that can be very, very tricky to answer. And I don't think either of us 100% have confidence in some declarative statements about who owns what or who's doing what, because another thing to consider is that these companies will partner with each other, will change ownership, will buy and sell. And so it could be different from day to day. I did notice there were some things in the chat about the sort of behind the scenes and Amazon being in charge. Absolutely. I mean, I think another safe bet is that Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Meta, these are all the huge digital landlords. So even if we are doing our best to avoid them, we might be participating in them because they rent out the digital space. So there's a lot that these corporate, this is one of the places where I know my students get frustrated, and I get frustrated too, because I want to know what's going on, right? I want the answers. I want to be able to make informed choices. But sometimes one of the ways of thinking about this is, why can't I find out these answers? Why can't I get declarative information on this? It's entirely possible that these corporations don't want knowledge about that, right? Facebook or Meta wants us to know about a lot of things. It wants us to know about Facebook. It wants us to know about Instagram. It wants us to know about their new partnership with Ray-Ban, where you can do all sorts of things through your Ray-Ban sunglasses. But there's a lot that it doesn't want us to know about, and will do what it can to kind of keep us in the dark. So at the risk of trying to not be totally 100% negative, we do want to address some of the opportunities, right? And like I said with Glean, one of the opportunities is that our students with documented disabilities get their data, they get their notes faster. They get to be on time with the rest of their classmates, which maybe in years past they were restricted from doing. I think many of us probably couldn't have gotten through COVID-19 without digital technology, right? If we look back at March of 2020, Zoom, thank you very much, swooped in and enabled so many of us to continue. It wasn't the same, and it certainly wasn't as valuable as being in a classroom for those of us that find being in a classroom valuable. But we would have, we couldn't have gotten through those years without some support by digital technologies, right? In large schools, I think about this at my own institution. Sometimes these technologies are the only way to capture and understand student progress, right? And then for large amounts of grading and or sharing coursework, sometimes these technologies can eliminate wasted time. Our concern is at what cost, right? Not only at what financial cost, but at what cost to what we might hold valuable. So we don't want to be 100% negative, nor do we want to be kind of here finger wagging, like, now you need to go back to your classrooms and your schools and like never use this again, but rather to try and present it as a complicated picture.
Yeah, and I do want to give answer a few of these questions, even though we sort of said there's some limits to what we can answer. But Mike asked a couple of great questions here about, should teachers put their work email on their phones? Obviously, that's a personal decision. There's at least some data I know that that would make that accessible, like where you log in and what you do in your email, that can be accessible by your institution who set up the server. Ditto on if you do personal work on, or sorry, if you access work email on your personal computer, same thing goes there. Using like an institution Wi-Fi, again, this is where it gets kind of murky. It depends on what agreements the school has with the Wi-Fi company as far as access to information. Sometimes that's transparent. Sometimes it's not. So it just depends. I think just making sure we didn't skip any other questions before we move on here. I think we answered most of those for now, but we can come back, or folks, if I skipped your question, feel free to let us know. Do you want me to jump into the threats here?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So this is kind of what I was we were foreshadowing just a moment ago, that we get the so what question, and we spent quite a lot of time trying to document all the different threats, some potential, some unfortunately, that have happened by having this data out there and accessible. And I think one of the key things we highlight immediately is we want to disabuse people of this idea that surveillance is secure. Now, schools, governments, some of the wealthiest companies on earth, they've been hacked, or they've had their data breached in one way or another. And it was so common that Alice and I couldn't even actually put a number on it with any accuracy, because they were happening so often in real time. We cited, previous studies that found thousands over certain timeframes, but these are common. And while we were researching the book, I mean, we would wake up every day, look at the news, and we'd be sending each other links to different breaches, and it just became insurmountable. So one of the things that we should be cautious of is, just because you may trust the institution, whether it be your school or some platform, it doesn't mean that other institutions or individuals are not going to get access to that information. Surveillance also shifts the autonomy. So students are the ones expected to monitor their privacy and try and nimbly go around the challenges that are presented by surveillance to their privacy. It puts a lot of onus on students, and this is really unfair to students on a multitude of levels, and faculty and staff as well. A lot of folks don't know the extent of what is going on, so they're not informed enough to nimbly kind of avoid some of this surveillance. One of the things that we brought up, and I anticipate this will be something that we will be discussing a lot in the future, is that if you go to a lot of the websites or the advertising marketing materials for these companies, they will tell you, number one, that they're FERPA compliant, which, as we've said, is technically true, but that's with the adjustments to FERPA since 2012. And then a lot of them talk about how they're DEI, they're focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And your institution would be moving in the direction of DEI if they would just adopt their platform or their server, their tool, whatever it may be. But by looking at what these companies actually do, we found that in many cases, they do the opposite. They actually work against institutions' commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and often exacerbate a lot of existing inequities within the education system. And this is for many reasons, but to kind of simplify it, algorithms do not think on their own. Algorithms do whatever their creators tell them to do with the data. And so if creators of the algorithm have an existing bias or prejudice, that'll often be reflected in the algorithm itself. And so to give you, some examples, some of these tools claim that they can predict criminality in students. And, this interests a lot of schools, because, they want to be proactive and stop the next school shooter, God forbid there be one, before shooting takes place. But the data that some of these platforms use generally point to vulnerable populations for criminality, particularly students of color. This may be in part because, data shows that people of color are more likely to be in the criminal justice system, but that's not because of more criminality. It's because of over policing. But the algorithm doesn't necessarily um, make that nuanced discussion. Or with some of the devices that scan the room to see if a student is cheating, a lot of those algorithms are trained on students who do not need any ability support. And so if you happen to be an ability challenge student and you may need some support, that support will be perceived by the platform as cheating. Now, this adds an extra challenge to a student's life already trying to pass the course. Now they need to also defend themselves against this algorithm, which is really difficult because how do you argue against an algorithm? And if the teacher in school use it, assign it, and believe in it, it becomes quite an uphill battle. So we really interrogate and question the commitment to DEI and students that a lot of these technologies claim. That's just on the learning side of it, and I'll briefly bring up a few other examples that we can talk about if folks want. But there's also a lot of reasons why people want privacy in the classroom, and the examples I just gave you are when the algorithms misread a person of color as a criminal or an ability challenge person as cheating. But there's also, real reasons people want privacy. If someone's documentation is contested, I don't think they want the government knowing where they live or who they live with or how to track them down, for example. There's victims of stalking who want to protect their privacy and do not want a stalker coming after them. Also, the classroom is a place where we get to play with ideas. The production of knowledge is quite dirty, as we all know. We make mistakes. We say things out loud we don't think about. We debate things. That necessitates some privacy. Students, and I would argue faculty for good reason, they're afraid to play with some of these ideas and think out loud and make mistakes when they know it can be possibly used against them or taken out of context. So it kills the learning process also. But it also, as Allison pointed out, sets people up to take things out of context. And closely related to that, I would also say from a faculty labor union perspective, unions, a lot of their success has always been grounded in having some degree of privacy where they can discuss when and if necessary to take action. Constant surveillance in school spaces is a threat to that as well. So I think there's a lot of threats. Those are just some I was listing off the top of my head. We can circle back and talk about some of those more, but I'll hand it over to Allison, talk about action steps.
So we're going to switch directions here a little bit. And Nolan and I have mentioned this a couple of times, but we come at this work from the position of critical media literacy, right? So just a little primer on that, if it's at all helpful. The sort of good old-fashioned, at this point, traditional definition of media literacy in the United States is the ability to access, analyze, and produce a variety of media. That came to us from the early 1990s. Obviously, the idea of production of a variety of media has changed a lot. This was the age of like camcorders were the wave of the future. So we know we've moved on, but its foundation is still there. Like, what can we get access to, which also involves what might be we restricted from, how do we analyze it, and then how do we operate as creators of a variety of media. When we talk about critical media literacy, we're adding on a couple of things to this, right? For critical media literacy, we are looking at the behind the scenes, right? We're not just focused on content or on representation, either visual or any other form of representation, but looking at ownership, production, and distribution. We're looking at how power operates. We're trying to understand that broader context, and we engage in a process of continuous critical inquiry. What is known about the text? How is it known? What is the context for understanding? What is the impacts of the text on individuals and society to the best of our understanding of it? So we come at this work. Again, we know that for the past hour or so, we've presented some really dark stuff, and we certainly see your comments in the chat, none of which we want to ignore, that have shared some dark stuff or your own questions or concerns. And Ricardo, you had a question in there about regulation, and yes, we're going to get to that in just a moment here, or ways of approaching regulation. But at the end of the day, we are both really working hard to maintain a certain level of optimism that this is how the world is operating right now, but it is not how the world needs to operate. I don't think digital technologies are going to go away by any stretch of the imagination, and I do think they're going to become much more sophisticated. But I think we agree that we are at a time right now where we can start making change. We can start pushing back. We can start shifting some of these relationships, and we want to be able to provide you some of that, both for your own use as well as use in the classroom, how you might work with your students. And so just to give you our context, we come at this from the work of critical media literacy. And we also want to kind of talk about why media literacy matters. I think we all are pretty aware that it's kind of ebbed and flowed over the years. Certainly after the 2016 election, we were very interested in fake news and this post-truth environment. Nolan has a great book on the sort of history of fake news, how it didn't actually start in 2016, and so that ways in which we can sort of understand our environment better. But critical media literacy matters for a lot of reasons. We learn so much about the world from our media, right? Uh, we are engaged with a variety of media from a young age, and media transmit messages about society. This is 20th century. It lasts to the 21st century, but we also need to think in the 21st century in particular about digital and social media. These are our dominant social tools. The vast majority of us get our news from social media. Social media are not news organizations, right? They're platforms that might share links to news, but they are not news. And yet that's where most of us are getting our quote unquote news. Young people and the rest of us, the not so young people, spend an extraordinary amount of time with an active and passive use of a great deal of media, and we're wanting to know at what cost. And then of course these digital footprints and algorithms can certainly feel out of control. We also think critical media literacy matters because it can help us prepare for what's next, right? If we take kind of a non-trendy, non-sort of fad way of looking at this, if we really try and think about it conceptually, we might be able to push back on some of these surveillance technologies. It can be what pushes back against these changes. It can also be a way of counteracting the siloification that so much of our digital technology construct in us. It can be a way of slowing down, right? Our social media are called social media, but I think it's pretty easy to see how isolating they are, how much time we spend alone with them, kind of staring at our screens or staring at our phones. We are sort of alone in that. And if we start working with critical media literacy, we can kind of push back against that. So much of our digital media encourages us to go through things really fast. That, ability to scroll through via our thumbs and just be kind of washed over with stuff. And then even something more kind of traditional, if you will, television viewing, where we can binge watch an entire season of something in one sitting. Everything we have in front of us these days encourages us to move really quickly. If we start to bring these conversations into the classroom, if we start to work together on this, we might be able to push back on that, and we might be able to slow down a little bit. So that's sort of our introduction and need for looking at this through critical media literacy. So, Ricardo, to your question about regulation, we've got a lot more of this, lot more of these tips and suggestions in the book, and some of the slides coming up are going to be really overly busy, mostly because we wanted to be able to share all of this stuff with you. But please feel free to move this stuff around as it is valuable for you. So one thing that we can do, particularly around that question of regulation, is start to look at legal support and see if we can start to make some inroads to the ways in which these laws and policies are made. So Nolan, I'm going to turn this bullet pointed list over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, one of the things we advocate for in the text, I think you guys have already sort of spoken to this in the chat though as well. But limiting data collection in these public institutions, I think more questions need to be asked about the utility. Is it worth it to collect this data? Is it necessary for the learning process, et cetera? So I think being more strategic, if we're going to collect data, being more strategic where we do collect data. Something other countries have adopted, and there's been a lot of advocates for here in the United States, is legislating the right to be erased. That we shouldn't have to live with a digital footprint of what we've done previously being around forever. We should have some control over that as the person themselves. One of the things we found consistently, time and time again, this isn't just in the education space, but certainly in the education space, a lot of these tech companies realize it's cheaper to break the law and get caught occasionally because the data is so valuable than it is to follow the law. And so, as someone who was a student in the 1990s when they rolled out the zero tolerance policies, perhaps we need to apply those zero tolerance policies to the ed tech companies themselves. One of the reasons why, or one of the reasons contributing, I think, to a lack of pushback against these companies is that they've been able to use their financial power and turn into political power. That is, they can influence politicians and influence school districts. So I think we also need to think about eroding some of that economic power. So one of the things we advocate for is what's known as a data dividend. This I first heard of from Mark Blythe and Eric Lundgren in their book Angrynomics. But essentially saying, if we're doing all this free labor online and we're giving up all of this data that's used to train very lucrative AI programs, we deserve a cut. We should get some of that money back in the form of a data dividend. Goes without saying, and we talked about this in the FERPA law, and I think a lot of you brought this up talking about COPA. There are existing laws up there that we just need to update. So adding updates to those laws to better protect students, faculty, staff, parents, and more. And then basically everything we've said and certainly has been talked about in the last year in news media in particular, but also in education spaces. Artificial intelligence is coming down the pipeline, and it's really being controlled by very few people. A lot of people out here where I live in the Silicon Valley area. And they're less than forthcoming about what the technology can and can't do. And so I think we need to be proactive in thinking about some of these demands, particularly for privacy, as artificial intelligence is rolled out as well. So those are some of the things we advocate for in terms of legal context. Do you want to cover some of the questions, Allison, for
Yeah.
teachers and students on the next slide?
Yep, absolutely. So a couple of you have been bringing up some things in the chat that I'm hoping our next couple slides will address. These are questions, I mean, we label them as questions for teachers and students because we imagine this happening in the classrooms, but I would also encourage these as questions for home. What privacy settings do I have control over on school assigned devices and platforms? And then maybe take that control, right? Turn off the location notifications. Make sure that to whatever extent possible, the private personal devices are being separate from work devices. What are the privacy practices of the ed tech companies contracted to our schools? So making sure that whatever is being contracted, anybody we don't expect these to go away, right? I think we've said that a few times right now, but what is it that we could potentially know more about them? And is there an opt-out? Right? Is there an opt-out? Can I use an alternate device? Can I use something different? That might get a little bit more cumbersome. It might not be as efficient, but if it's a way of protecting privacy and it sends a certain message, maybe that is sort of the way to go. So again, these are questions that we label as questions for teachers and students, but they're also just questions for any single one of us in any part of our choice making. Individual action steps. And we want to put a caveat on here, especially on this first one, separate technology use when possible. We recognize that that in and of itself is somewhat contradictory because it is those of us who can separate technology use, right? Those of us who have personal and professional devices that can do this. And we understand that there are populations that cannot do that. But if a young person or a teacher or whomever whomever cannot separate technology use because it is the only technology they have available to them, then maybe taking some of these other steps a little bit more proactively can be helpful. Turn off notifications. So it is so easy on our phones or on our computers to have just a barrage of information, right? Um, and if we turn off notifications, we don't necessarily have to look at the latest photo memory or the New York Times headline, right? Or the Instagram post. We can make it a choice of ourselves when we go to those locations versus it prompting us and sort of tempting us with it. As often as possible, clear your cache, right? That data is already there. But if we clear the cache, there's more opportunity for our own device to just be kind of within our own control. Reject cookies. I've actually been practicing this and sort of like trying to time it when I've gone on a new website, is to just do the like manage the cookies. And it doesn't take but a couple of seconds, right? Sometimes there's the opportunity to reject them all. Sometimes it's you have to accept mandatory ones. But if we reject them, just little bits and pieces of our data are back in our own control. Ask questions, right? Keep asking the questions. This is part of critical media literacy, is this process of continuous critical inquiry. Why am I getting this advertisement so quickly after I did this web search, right? Um, uh, why am I suddenly, who does this YouTube or Netflix think that I am? Like, what messages might be out there about me? One thing that isn't on this list, but I think it's kind of a fun thing to try, is to make your language a little bit less branded. So it's super easy to say, oh, I'm just going to Google that. Well, what about just not saying the word Google, right? They're fine. They don't need our advertising or our marketing. What about saying, I'm going to search for that? It's actually one less syllable, right? It's a smaller word. You know, one of the marketing goals of Juul, the e-cigarette, the vaping corporation, one of their marketing goals was to be a generic term, the same way we use Xerox or Kleenex when we're not actually exclusively talking about those brands, right? Juul wanted to be both a noun and a verb, that no matter what brand people were using, they were Juuling. Um, Maybe we take that away from something like Google. Maybe we take that away from something like iPhone or Microsoft or Facebook. And we just sort of shift our own language. We have total control over that. It's something that we can kind of do on our own. And I'm going to now look something up. I'm going to search something versus I'm going to Google something. Maybe it can just give us a little bit of our own autonomy back again. This is where we get into some of the stuff that's really super busy. So before we do that, or busy as far as the slides go, I see a bunch of stuff coming up in the chat that I don't want to ignore. Yes, I'm seeing this about clear your history. And thank you, Rashid, that it's clearing the history that's on your device. Absolutely. And let's see, I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything else here.
There was one other question that we're going to answer, but there was a
Okay.
question from someone who I forget, so I can't find it right now, but essentially asked, do we have a list of some of these steps that people and organizations can take? And the answer is yes. That is, there it goes, Carrie. There.
Okay.
Sorry, Carrie. Yeah, that information we have, and we put it together in the text. It's quite it's organized by talking to different groups, basically. We're talking to the school, the student, the parent, the teacher, the voter, the whatever. So we go down in that kind of sense. And so after we talk about some of the steps in the classroom, we can open it up for that too, Carrie.
So what we have here are we envision these as being valuable for K through 12, with some adjustments, obviously, for earlier learners and for higher education. It's a way of understanding critical surveillance pedagogy. So and these are activities that both of us have done in our classes, often to it's one of these like, this felt really dark, but I learned a lot from it. So usually I start not specifically at the beginning of the unit, but at the beginning of my class, the very beginning of the semester, asking students to build a pro con list, and I keep it really generic. I just say a pro con list of media, and I let them sort of determine what they think media are and why is this con, and then I collect that and I just hold on to it for the semester. They forget about it, which makes it kind of really fun at the end of the semester when I give it back to them. Um, Ask students to keep a documentation for 24 hours of all their media use. Um, no judgment, right? Absolutely no judgment. And it's a really good thing for them figuring out sort of how they're spending their time. And then after this 24-hour period, see how long they can go with no media. And it's no judgment and it's no pressure. One of the things I tell my class is that, the 8 hours that you're sleeping doesn't count, and they all laugh at me because they don't sleep for 8 hours. And some of them will admit, no, I wake up in the middle of the night to check my phone just to make sure nothing happens. So they're not even necessarily sleeping through the night, but see how long they can go with no media. And then 48 hours, so a little bit more time, build a digital footprint journal. Like, what is all of their digital media use? How big is their footprint? I would say for, if you have students, or if you tend to be more of a visual instructor, like, make it a footprint, right? See how big it can get. And then reflecting on that 48-hour journal, right? What did they do? What did they see? What did they learn from it? And then thinking about kind of flipping the narrative a little bit based on their own experiences. What do these companies know about them? What might they be interested in? So that's a way of starting to understand surveillance through looking at their own activities. This slide, again, like I said, these are all pretty busy for here, but we're going to be sharing this with you afterwards. Helps with some definitions. So if you're struggling, or if you're wanting to teach students some of the vocabulary, going through all of this can help with the language. This is ways of understanding how how surveilling is not brand new, right? That it is certainly heightened in this digital environment, but we can look at it through the lens of history, and through intersecting lenses, certainly around gender and class, and understanding how surveillance has been part of our humanities for ages. And then kind of another way, because again, we don't want to leave everybody too totally in the dark, but a way of resisting, right? Have our students turn off their notifications, and then see what happens when they make choices, and they can compare and contrast that against their digital technology footprint. Another way is understanding each other. How often are they doing it, right? Many of us who teach in college probably know that our students use the Find My app. Find My app was ostensibly started as a way of sort of safety, right? And maybe it was also about if we ever lost our phone. But one of the things that I've learned from my students is that they use it to track their friends, but they also use it as a problem solver if their friends aren't texting them back quickly enough. If they have the Find My app on and they see that their friends might be in a classroom, they might be like, okay, they're not texting me back because they're in class. So there's sort of a kind of their own edification about their value as human beings. But like, who are they tracking, right? Who are they monitoring, and why? And I've certainly talked with many students who have said they keep the Find My app on in case they're like walking home by themselves at night, or if they don't know exactly where they are geographically, that it can present this feeling of safety. And then both Nolan and I work with Project Censored, and we work with the validated independent news stories. This works best in colleges, but if you are K through 12 teacher, there's ways to kind of shift the project to work better. But for your age group. Students can identify a news story that is undercovered. It gives them an opportunity to explore things that are interesting to them. And what might be interesting to them is not necessarily what's covered by the corporate press. And then again, with that part of that definition of media literacy about creation, they can create something. They can create an advertisement, a short video, their own news broadcast, a podcast, a song, whatever. It can be low tech, it can be high tech. I've done some cut and paste projects in my class that are just like such wonderful time. They're chatting with each other. They're using glue sticks and crayons. They leave all their like cool college kid stuff behind and just get really into the arts and crafts of it all. And they can introduce the problem and a potential solution. So this is the way that they can also kind of take ownership of their of their media use and maybe start to see it in a different way. So I'm going to move off this slide, off the sharing and off the PowerPoint right now, because this is really blank on purpose. We want to know what we can do to support you. Just to give you a little preview, we've got some educator resources for you towards the end of this, some books, open source books that might be helpful, websites. We've got, this is a little, shameless promotion. Nolan and I are two of the co-authors of The Media and Me, a guide to critical media literacy for young people. It's the only critical media literacy book for young readers.